Today, let's talk about what does our watch collecting journey really mean? What does it play in our life? Um, I think for me, watches have been playing a major role in my life. They're a daily part of my life, a daily part of my existence. Um, Something I think of constantly throughout the day is watches, is horology. It's the channel. It's the shop. It's all consuming, at least for a certain amount of time throughout the day. I would say my watch collecting journey started a very long time ago. I would say probably when I was in, I would say middle school. The interest was there. Growing up, didn't really think of watches probably till I was in middle school. Probably till I saw other people with watches, with nice watches, and I think maybe that sparked the curiosity and for me to learn more. And I'm thinking this is back in what middle school, so I'm thinking what 2002, 2003. It was just kind of like way before all of the stuff we see today on the internet and social media. Before there was a million YouTube channels dedicated to watches, and all we really had back then were like the magazines. The watch magazines, the ones you see at Barnes and Noble or Borders. I remember going all the time and picking up those magazines. Even just the catalogs. If you were lucky to get on a mailing list for a catalog, that was very cool. I remember for a long time I had the Gray and Sons jewelry store catalog that would come every month, and just to look back at like what those prices were back then compared to how they are now is just insane. But definitely my watch collecting journey started young, probably around middle school. I think my first cool watch was like a Swiss military watch. I think my mom bought me I think it was like a Pulsar chronograph. Um, I remember, not just the magazines, but like those TV watches, like the Watch Channel, stuff like that, where a guy would sell like Chase Durr watches and like C Pro and like Oceanaut, all these like just generic TV brands. Of course, Invicta was a big deal back then when they were selling it on TV and stuff like that. There were few outlets, so it was like interesting to tune into those things, just to watch, and eventually bought a couple of those watches, and I mean they are what they are, but it's still part of the fun, still part of the hobby, especially when you're just getting into it and you're learning about the brands and learning about just what's out there. And at that time, it was just you really had to go out of your way to really learn about watches. I think for me, probably as I got into high school, still keeping up with the magazines and stuff like that, and like you're working on the side, making some money. I remember buying a couple watches, and I think my first what I thought was a cool watch, I bought like an ESQ. It was like a square ESQ watch I bought from like Hellsberg Diamonds, which is like a jewelry chain store. It was a dress watch because it had like an all black dial, kind of like a Movado, and then it had like four little diamonds on like the 36912. And it had a bracelet, and it was like kind of like square, and I thought it was like the coolest thing ever. I think I paid like 430 for it. I thought I was just the coolest thing ever, and I mean it. When you're young, and it is cool for a while. But yeah, it was things like that where you're not really know what you're looking for. You're really just trying everything out. I think when I turned, because I remember I had like a couple of like stuff like that, and like a couple like Invictas and stuff, and just really low quality, and I mean they weren't low quality, but it was just kind of like the value was there for the price. I remember Invicta Speedways were a big deal, because it looks like a Daytona, so it's like you have this pretty cool homage looking watch, and different colors and all this stuff. I think when I turned 18, my dad bought me a Maurice Lacroix chronograph, which was very cool. That was probably my first real nice watch. Wore that for many years. And I think once I got out of high school and just started to be able to go out more, go to stores and stuff like that, and check out, boutiques and stuff. And honestly, I feel like I would look at watches more often back then in person than I do now. Now I don't really go out of my way to go look at, whatever a jewelry store has, because I feel like at this point, like, I know what they have and probably don't really care for what it is. I mean, it's cool to see it, but I won't go out of my way to go pay, especially with what retail is asking for now. It's like, it's cool to look at, but, unless you're, I don't know, a regular customer for them or something, it's, you're going to pay over retail price. But I think when I got to college and, was really just, had some money to spend, I think that's really when I started to really, just explore, the watch world. I think in, like 2012, 2013, that's really when I started serious, started to get serious, and I was actually putting my own watches together. And I don't know where that came from. It's kind of something I may have just started trying with, like, kind of a couple of like beater watches, just cheap stuff, and just taking it apart and, messing with it, coloring the dials and the hands and, taking stuff apart. I think that's really where that came from. And I just started doing it more and more. And probably by like 2016, 2017, I was doing that regularly with like 6497, like manual wind homages, Panerai looking stuff. I was doing that a lot, with sandwich dials, painting the dials, the hands, aging the cases. And I think that was really my thing, was like making it look kind of like vintage. So like, distressing the case and all the parts and everything, but still having like a, like a modern, a brand new manual movement in there. I did that for a while. And then around that time, I also started doing like dive watches. So like using like Tiger Concept and like some of their base models, like Submariner style stuff, and like their GMT models, and just, aging them out differently, buying different parts, bezel inserts, crystals, bracelets, straps, everything you can think of, and just, making them look vintage. And I think I did that for a really long time. And I think it was that time where like things really started to explode within the watch world, especially with social media. Especially when you saw brands like Hodinkee come on board, and like that first episode of Talking Watches, and everybody just got hooked on that. Everybody rode that train into the ground. I think once Instagram became popular and everybody who had watches started posting on their every day. I think for the most part, a lot of us still do. Those of us who still have time to do that. I think from there, it just really took off. People really started to pay attention to it. And you started to see all these little communities form. Well, like for me, like the online watch forums, those were always there. Those have been there since before social media. If you were a member of like a watch community, I mean, those have been, and people have been buying and selling watches on those platforms for forever. Even for me, I think that's really where I started, buying and selling was, on the online forums, and, meeting people. And it's crazy because some of those people I still deal with today. Because when I opened my shop in, I think 2017, a lot of those people were from those forums, and like we still do business. They still come and check out my shop and will still buy from me. And it's just crazy to think, we've been selling to the same person for like, I don't know, almost, 6-7 years now. But it's really cool because I think for me, before I opened my shop, I was just kind of like, I was on all platforms. I was on eBay, I was on Etsy, and we were selling to people all over the world because that's just the reach that those platforms give you. It wasn't until 2017, because everything was just getting so popular and everything was moving so fast, and then you had like the vintage watch bubble that was coming up, and everybody was talking about vintage, and at that time the prices were still okay, nothing was getting too crazy. It wasn't until like maybe 2018, 2019, and then during the pandemic where prices just kind of skyrocketed. And so it was cool to be able to find pieces back then, and that weren't as expensive as they are now. especially the vintage stuff. But I mean, I think I really got, I think because I was, building vintage style watches with some of those mods I was doing, I think that really pushed me into the vintage side. And that's really where I stayed and for a long time, just buying vintage watches and eventually when I opened my shop in 2017, that's really where I started to sell a lot of this, vintage stuff and some of the stuff that I was putting together. It was about half and half. People were interested in, one thing. They were really interested in one thing, and then, more so than if they liked the builds, they were mostly just going towards that. If they like vintage stuff, they would just buy all the vintage stuff. It was nice, to be able to have people that like specific things, and that's what they were looking for, and they would know to go to you to find those things. But that was an interesting time, at least for me, where there was, so much availability of stuff, because it's kind of like people were just kind of like figuring it out, and figuring out the importance of certain brands and certain models. I think, for some people, there are people that always knew. They always knew, and they were always part of the watch community. And I think when, the boom of Instagram really brought everything to the forefront. And I think for a lot of us, it just became more of an outlet. We had more avenues to go and, and learn and check out stuff and, meet people and, just discuss and trade and sell. That really opened up the opportunity for a lot of people in the watch community. And I think for me around that time is when I started the channel, the Last Watchology channel. And it started small, doing a couple reviews, just anything. I really just wanted to get into the storytelling part of it, tell the history, talk about the brands and, significance of watches and, throughout history, throughout, the 20th century. And we have a lot of videos on, World War II. We have that whole, history and horology playlist. So a lot of that is, vintage stuff about World War II, watches of World War I, and all types of very cool, military history stuff. And, even we talk about film, film history and, watches in the film industry and, famous actors, what they wore back in, in this movie or, during the 40s, 50s. And I try to keep it, very, I don't know. I don't really, go to extremes. I know there's, a lot of channels out there that talk about, and I think that's really, where a lot of the trends picked up is people started, reviewing like celebrity stuff and, really just, anything, that's going to get quick views and stuff like that. But I really just kind of keep it, I don't know, just to like, what I want to talk about. But yeah, that period of, the late, 2010s where, it really just blew up, watch collecting, at least for me, it took it to a whole new level that, I don't know. I don't think I ever really expected that. I mean, growing up, it was just, this is what this is, and this is a cool watch, and, see something that's, expensive, and, it's like, wow. It was almost like an exclusive club of, who has that and, who wears that. And I think the more, things kind of blew up, it's kind of like that, those walls kind of came down where it's like, oh, well, you can go buy that used for X amount and, no big deal. I think for me, there were always people that kind of, made it seem like, oh, that's not for you, or, why do you have that, or, how much did you pay for that? And now I'm like, well, we've had, I don't know how many of, certain watches and certain brands, like, screw you, like, we've had it already. We've had it already for a long time. I'm past the point where it's like, oh, I need to, prove something to anyone. It's really been there, done that at this point. Because I think for a long time, I guess because when you're not around people who are watch collectors as much as you are just people that want an expensive watch and they think that that's a big thing, and they have, several expensive watches and, they make it seem like, oh, it's, I have this and you don't. And then, now at least where it's like, those are everywhere, you can go to any, forum, and people are trading one, and people are selling this, and it's just not a big deal anymore. And it's funny because, at least for me personally, like it's like I'm past that point where it's like I have to prove anything to anyone. I got into this because I enjoy it, because I like it, because I love watches. You have the passion for it, and I think that it's something that separates you from other people where it's just like, oh, I have this expensive watch and I buy them because they hold the value and all that stuff. And we all know that crowd. And they don't buy anything else because they're not real watch collectors. So it's like they don't buy anything else. Like they would never be caught wearing, any of these micro brands, or, it's just, they stick to a specific brand and that's it. And that's all they buy. And then it's like anything else to them is like, oh, whatever. But I think for me, the watch collecting journey is one of, passion, because, it's something that becomes a part of your daily life, your daily routine. For me, it really is something that is part of my identity. It's something that adds to your personality. It adds to your character. And anyone that knows you knows that that's, something that's, that you like. It sets you apart. Is it a hobby that's expensive? Oh, yeah. It doesn't have to be. I mean, I think we all choose to go after what we like. You can buy, 5 Seikos, or you can buy one, Speedmaster or something. You know what I mean? Like, you can, it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be an expensive hobby. It can be in the long run. I mean, I think for the most part, if we all look back and see how much we spent on watches, I imagine it'd be astronomical. But then again, how many of us have, sold many watches? How many of us have had watches where we've sold the watch and that watch has, saved our butt for a while? How many of us have done that where, we get into that, the trading and the selling, and you're kind of like your own little watch dealer. And it's like, yeah, watches are important. What you want, what you buy, what you sell is important. Especially if it puts money in your pocket, and especially if that is important to you. So yeah, I mean, it makes it makes a difference in terms of what you have and what you're selling, because at least for me, there's that part that's the passion, and then there's the part of me that's like, yeah, if I have a vintage shop, and yes, there's a lot of cool vintage stuff out there, but how much of it is something that people want to buy? To someone that doesn't know, and they'll say, oh, this is very rare, this is very unique, and they're selling it for a butt ton of money. But if nobody knows that brand, if nobody knows what, if it doesn't mean anything to anyone, so it's like, a watch is only worth what someone, like they say, it's only worth what someone's willing to pay for it. And so for me, it's important as a watch seller, that we stick to specific brands, that we stick to specific models. If we're vintage, we want to stick to models that we know, hey, you know what, this can be easily serviced. You don't want to buy like some weird, quartz movement from the 80s that's, wasn't very reliable. So it's kind of like you have to know the history of what you're selling to be able to back it up and say, yes, this is a quality vintage watch with a quality vintage movement. As compared to like selling a 1980s, Seamaster quartz movement that wasn't very good, that doesn't last very long, and then you end up getting yourself into trouble with buyers. So for me, that's always important, is to avoid that conflict. Is making sure that you're selling something that is going to be working, that is, a quality watch, rather than just selling a bunch of crap. Because there are sellers out there that just fill their website with a bunch of watches that they probably don't even know if they even work or not. And that's okay. I mean, these days it's, at this point in time where it's like there's like a million dealers out there now, a million watch dealers, and they all have a website, and they all have the quality stuff, right? Quality website, quality, pages and all that stuff. And it's just a lot now, like it's everywhere. It was almost like a time where it was cool when it felt like there were only like a few people actually doing this stuff, and now it's just like everywhere. And YouTube's the same thing. There's a new watch channel every day, it seems like. And a lot of them, it's kind of like they're like the dealers, they want to show people doing trades and doing, negotiations and stuff like that. Like they just want, I don't know, they just want to show that part of it. And it's kind of like, for me, that came out of the whole, watch flipper trends of, late COVID, where everybody wanted to be a watch flipper. And everybody was buying a Submariner that they were going to go flip somewhere, and it just kind of like, that's just like the trend. And it's like, and it gets views. Like a lot of those channels get views, and I don't know who watches that stuff. I can only watch it for so long. For me, if you're not telling me a story, if you're not keeping me engaged, then it's like, you can only watch, so many times somebody's selling an AP or something, at some trade show. Some of it is entertaining, I'll give it that. But is there a lot of passion? Do you feel like there's passion in the product and in the quality of the videos? Not so much. I mean, unless they're paying someone to do it for them, yeah. But for me, it's, and that's part of the journey, right? That's part of the hobby. It's part of the interest, part of the passion to, look at all the different aspects of watch collecting and, watch selling, I guess you could say also. Because, we pay attention to all of it. We pay attention to all, whether it's stuff that's going on in the industry, whether it's, new releases, and the brands more than ever know that people are paying attention now, and I think that's why it kind of created momentum to, shake things up and, really they have an opportunity to really present what's new to a huge audience now. And I feel like it took a long time for brands to realize that. Is that this is a real community now, the watch community. It's a real thing now. And you might say, that it's, split between people that, are actually passionate about it, and other people that are just like, I'm just here to, buy things that hold value, But anyway, to each their own. But I mean, I do know, as big as the watch community is now, it does feel small when you think of like who around you is a watch collector. Where is the nearest watch collector near you? I think for me, that's something that's questionable, because it's, you don't really see anything around you that's like, you might see a guy that's like has an expensive watch, but it's like he might not even be a watch guy, that somebody may have given that to him, or he, bought that with his first big check, and, he thinks he's the coolest thing in town. So it is hard. It is hard. It can be a lonely hobby, especially if, you don't really communicate with people. I mean, for me, it's mostly online, talking to people through forums or, Instagram, or, just the regular people that are like, hey, I'm looking for this, or, hey, like, are you selling this watch? And it's just like regular thing, or people, just sharing pictures with you and stuff like that. Or, when the forums have like a daily, wrist check, and you go and you post what you're wearing today, or, if you have your own community, like on YouTube, or on Instagram, and, you post daily, basically, your watches. There's that. But like the in-person thing, I think that sometimes, especially unless you don't live in a big city, and unless you're not part of those meetups that can sometimes be hard to find, it is a lonely hobby sometimes. So you really have to go out of your way to really search for that connection that's in person. But we can save that for a later date. But I wanted to keep this short today, in terms of watch collecting. Where that started for me, where I feel it's going. I mean, for right now, I just feel like I'm in a good, comfortable place where, watches, are just part of my life, in some form or another. And I'm happy with it. I love watches. I love every aspect of it. But I just wanted to keep this short. So I hope you guys enjoyed this first episode of the podcast, and I will catch you guys later.